Thank you very much, Dr. Mahfoud, my friend. And I'd like to welcome everybody to this historic meeting. I've been saying that for quite a number of years at different conferences that I've been at, in which I've been participating, starting with ones that began in 2001 at the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin, to which I had been invited to give a presentation. That subsequently got me involved in doing a couple of dozen more since then, with the goal of working with the Lublin School of Thomism. And Holy Apostles College and Seminary has had a long history of involvement with the Lublin School of Thomism. In fact, the Pope John Paul II's philosophical works were largely introduced to the United States through a former rector at Holy Apostles who had been involved in getting introduced to the United States a work from the Lublin School of Thomism. And so John Paul II was very much interested in repersonalizing philosophy and focusing attention on philosophical activity and its nature. And I consider that to be a historic event that in recovering a proper understanding of the nature of philosophy that I wanted to continue. And so I consider myself to be on a providential mission in a way to do that. And I've developed my own understanding of how best to do that, which actually had started in the 1980s with me after I'd read a work by Jacques Maritain. At the time, I was vice president of the American Maritain Association. Maritain had written one of his last works, The Peasant of the Garonne, in which he begged his readers not to take the statement he was going to make to be that of a crazy old man when he said that modern philosophy, strictly speaking, is not philosophy. And I had a lot of respect for Maritain, I still do. And I thought, well, I should investigate this and see whether he was right. And so it took me until 1997. So I worked at least I'd say a dozen years on this, and I concluded that Maritain was right. And he had said that unless you reunite philosophy and science and wisdom, well, reunite philosophy and science, that it would not be possible to have world peace, future peace. And I tried to figure out how to do that. And after a while, I figured out the only way you could do that was to reunite philosophy and science and wisdom. So I wound up writing a work on what I entitled A Not So Elementary Christian Metaphysics in 2 volumes that was published with Sebastian Mahfoud's En Route Books and Media also to start that. And I've been continuing on that mission since that time. So in a way, what I'm attempting to do here is repersonalize philosophy, and in a sense, start out trying to solve this question by taking this repersonalized philosophical approach. At the beginning of his toward the beginning of his work on the heavens, Aristotle says that small mistakes in the beginning make large mistakes down the road. They multiply down the road. And what he meant by that was, if you're wrong about your principles, your principles are the starting point for your reasoning. We don't start investigations with reasoning. We start investigation with understanding and with principles. For the most part, contemporary intellectuals do not understand the nature of a principle the way Aristotle had used this term. I was lucky when I was at St. John's University to sit across the desk a couple of feet from a brilliant Dominican. It hasn't been too well heard of. His name was Charles Bonaventure Crowley. And he spent 50 years basically studying the nature of principles in St. Thomas. He came down with spinal arthritis and wasn't able to complete a work on the Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy of measure and a correlation of the teachings of St. Thomas and that of Aristotle. And what he did was he took principles from St. Thomas related to the nature of unity. Spent 50 years studying the nature of unity and analogously transposed them into the international system of units to show how all the principles in the international system of units are analogous transpositions of the metaphysical principle of unity, and related chiefly to qualities in the contemporary world. It's a brilliant, absolutely brilliant work. So that work had a lot of influence on me. And one of the things I learned from Aristotle related to this, in relationship to this topic that we have today of media bias, the manipulation of faith, science, and technology, was that Aristotle, when he was talking about a principle, didn't mean a logical premise. Okay, one of the first principles of science is the scientist, or the philosopher. To me, philosophy and science are identical, and both of them are forms of behavioral organizational psychology. They're both species of psychology. That's radically different from the way in which contemporary scholars look at philosophy in general. People understand that, or science. But I'm convinced that this is true. That's the best way to understand what people who are involved in science or in philosophy are doing. The first principle of science is a scientist. If you were no scientist, you'd have no science. And to the extent that you cut off science from wisdom, you're not a scientist. You're a fool. You don't need to be a genius to show that that anybody who does that has no proper understanding of the nature of human understanding or knowledge in its most excellent form, right? So I dismiss that notion just on that basis. That principle that Aristotle articulates indicates that when we use the word principle, we're using it analogously, we're predicating analogously. And chiefly, we simply mean a starting point, that from which we begin our reasoning. If you don't understand anything, if you don't know anything, evidently you can't begin your reasoning. And one of the biggest mistakes that modern thought has made since the 17th century is to think that you have to prove your first principles. That's absolutely absurd. Your first principles are evident truths. You know that evidently that it is the case. For example, that you know what you're talking about. If you claim that you have to prove everything, how are you going to prove that you know what you're talking about before you start talking to somebody? How are you going to prove that to them? Science is conversational. Philosophy, as identical with science, is also, both of them are conversational. We transmit them in terms of media, as the title of this today's meeting, today's presentation indicates. So Aristotle always starts his investigations with defining his subject matter, right? Which is the way I'm going to proceed. I never write out what I'm going to talk about, and I don't really like talking from written lectures. What I do is I start with the definition, and I analyze the parts of the definition and the implications that are found in the definition. And when you're talking about my approach is going to be more abstract and historical than Tom Sheehan's approach, which is they're good complements. He's going to take a different angle on helping the members of the audience understand contemporary media bias. I'm approaching this more or less on an understanding of the nature of bias, considering as philosophers are inclined to do, what is the nature of this subject considered universally. So wherever you find it, you find this. Now, there are two words that are used in this title that are especially interesting related to this. One is, well, three, media, and bias and manipulation. Right? These are all first principles of our understanding. If we don't understand these correctly, we're going to get in all sorts of difficulty resolving the problem. A media can be any kind of means, but we're talking chiefly of a means of communication, and what Mortimer Adler called two-way talk, conversational speaking, rather than simply one-way talk or lecture. Those involved in the media tend to understand themselves as intermediaries between one thing and another thing, or one being and another being. And bias indicates unjust discrimination. So media bias, abstractly considered, is very easy to identify, at least in general, that it's a kind of unjust discrimination. Right? Now, since injustice, since prudence, if we accept what Aristotle says about this in St. Thomas, and common sense, the prudence is the form of all virtues. To the extent that you're not doing something prudentially, you're not applying whatever virtue you have at the right time and in the right situation, for example, in the right place. When I was at St. John's, I had a lot of Italian students in my classes. I'd have a lot of Irish students in the classes. And I would always caution my Irish students never to go to an Italian wake and sing Danny Boy to express your condolences. That if you did that, you would be lacking in common sense. And prudence is just a form of common sense. It's what's commonly known, commonly understood to be a starting point. It involves understanding your first principles. A person with no common sense, who can't act prudentially, doesn't know the principles that everybody else who knows the subject applies. Right? And in a situation to be able to reason out and draw a proper conclusion about some difficulty confronting a person. So common sense is pretty much an easy concept to grasp. Most of us have none of it most of the time because we're not familiar with a lot of things. Most of the things with which everybody else is familiar all over the world. We have a very narrow area in which we have this, and when we try to deal with a new problem, we first have to define our subject matter so that we're dealing with it from the standpoint of common sense, what anybody who knows about this subject understands to be taken for granted. These are assumptions that we don't have to really investigate. Now, manipulation can refer to misusing something, or it can simply refer to integrating. And I think that I test probably in coming up with this topic, focused attention on the misuse rather than the integration. But they're not totally entirely divorced. That there's still that sense that how are we integrating at the same time as we might be misusing the relationship among these different psychological habits of faith and science and technology. Okay, now so that was one of the first principles I'm using. Okay, and I can answer the question very easily about what's the cause of media bias. If we're talking about it in a universal and kind of abstract way, it's not applying justice and prudence in the reporting of what's going on. Right? If we're talking to modern media in the sense of communications media, like radio and television and print media, but it's if we want to understand it in more detail and why it's widespread. Okay, what makes media bias so widespread and entrenched today that it creates those who have it a kind of tunnel vision, right? Where today we use contemporary terms like a reductionism, where a person reduces the whole of a genus to one of its species and superimposes on the genus the characteristics of the species, or where people can't think outside the box. We sometimes talk about it today as a tunnel vision, a beltway mentality. I often, if you're talking about really intelligent people doing this, I call these people who are encyclopedias open to the wrong page. This type of psychological attitude on the part of people causes them to reject the reality of truth. In the sense that there is some sort of they're in some sort of external relationship between parts and wholes in the things around us, which, as far as I understand, anything we understand in terms of organizations, and when we define them to try to explain, make intelligible to others what we're talking about, we locate them in a genus and a species. If we can't, if we're imprecise in being able to communicate what we're talking about, it's precisely because we don't have our definitions correct. So you always have to. This is why Aristotle always starts off defining a subject matter, because as St. Thomas says, the whole of a science is contained in its principles. And its principles are contained in its definitions, because the definitions of a thing contain the nature of the thing, and the nature of a thing is its organization. And the organization of a thing, the way parts harmonize to organize into an organizational whole, enable you to understand the actions that are being generated by that organization. You deny the reality of natures and things, which so many contemporaries do. You'll deny the reality of organizational behavior. Right? And if you deny the reality of final causes, which so many people do today, you can't explain the nature of organizations, because organizations that are aimless have they're not organizations. They're anarchic. And in a sense, all media bias today, in general, entrenched, is reducible to this mistake that was made in the 17th century of trying to get rid of the notion of aims in things and organizational wholes, and say that we can't really understand them. We can't comprehend their behavior, or if we can, the only people who can do it are mathematical physicists, and everybody else, you just have opinion, and so there is no truth in that. There's only truth in scientific positivism. That's, in a nutshell, the main problem that we're faced with today. Scientific positivism rejects the reality of truth or reduces it to mathematical physics. It tends to argue that what can't be proven can't possibly be true. There's no evident truth unless you can prove it. And they've got no proof for this claim that the whole of truth is reducible to mathematical physics, because they don't demonstrate that by means of numbers and so forth. They do it in terms of ordinary speech and so forth. This leads to all sorts of cultural difficulties. So the second principle I work with in attacking this problem is one that was made by Etienne Gilson. And he thinks over the centuries, somehow he got that it transferred to him from the dramatist Menander, who once said that we live life the way we can, not the way we choose. And Gilson remarks that we think the way we can, right? And not the way we wish. And I extend that to also not the way we choose. Once you would lay down your philosophical principles, Gilson says, and you try to apply them to the real world, very often people find that the principles are not able to explain how something that you're talking about, your subject, operates or can operate in the real world. It doesn't make them intelligible. And so the test of truth that we actually give to whether or not our principles are right is whether or not they actually can generate action, cause action. And make action intelligible to us in the real world, which makes sense because this is what the ancient Greeks were. If you think that philosophy in the West starts with the ancient Greeks were chiefly interested in action and trying to make it intelligible in terms of the principles of the one and the many, the problem of the one and the many, which many people in philosophy reduce to a problem of ancient physics, but it was actually the problem in philosophy for the whole of antiquity and remained the problem of philosophy, which Gilson himself didn't see to some extent. Gilson focused attention on the nature of existence and how important that was in making things intelligible, which is totally correct. It was a genius move on his part. The only problem is that it doesn't really relate too much to what you're doing in science, because science, people who are investigating scientifically are interested in the behavior of organizational wholes and how their parts can be integrated to produce action or not produce it, how you can unite and divide organizations, and leaders especially have to know this. So if you don't understand the nature of organizations and the way they operate and how truth is related to that, and how you can apply that properly, you totally destroy the understanding of the nature of leadership, which is what modern thought, contemporary thought, has largely done, and which I'm trying to reverse. So investigations, as Aristotle says, that they have to start with this definition of the subject matter and being as precise as possible as you can in that, and defining the subject matter. What you're doing is you're defining yourself in relationship to it. When I started class, whenever I start courses, I ask people precisely who they are and where they are and why they're there and where they're going, right? And I do that to put them in a real genus, because we always think and choose in relationship to our understanding of what is a real genus, which I identify with an organization, an operational organization. And simultaneously, we belong to a lot of different genera. We're human beings. We can be brother or sister, mother or father. We can be somebody who's at work, in our office. We can be moving in between. We can be driving, in which case we're a driver, and so forth, right? And we have to keep these different organizational relationships in which we're involved, which are our situations. Another way to understand what the nature of a genus is the way I understand it. A real one. It's our situation. If you take, say, Thomas's traditional 8 acts, which he gets from Aristotle, that are the circumstances or conditions of a moral act, they're the circumstances or condition of any act. Who is doing what, to what, with what, where, why, when, and how. Right? If you know that, you know your situation. You know an organization. Whenever you act, someone is acting, and those who, what, and why, and so forth, and to what. Those are Aristotle's 4 causes. You take Aristotle's 4 causes, and you add time and place, and you add instrument to that. And you come up with the notion of a real genus. Whenever we're acting in time and place, right? We're applying different causes. Those causes are principles, and they either generate action or they don't generate action, but you have to know how to harmonize all of these activity, because an organization exists in the harmony of its parts. Or where does a genus exist? Where does a real genus exist? Etienne Gilson, in one of his last works, 3 Tasks in Philosophy, talks about species. And he says species exist in zoos, among other things. Real species exist in zoos. But this is amazing. This man was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And he understood that you couldn't understand philosophy unless you understood the notion of genus and species, because the ancient problem of the one and the many was a problem of how genus and species are related. And he said he didn't know the answer to that. Which means he didn't know what philosophy was, which was true. He didn't, precisely as he admitted, and he did in a way, but he didn't. And one of the things that got me in trouble in trying to understand philosophy and trying to understand this question, how to approach it, is that Gilson misled me by making a statement which seemed to me to be right on the money. He said that most philosophical mistakes start from badly framed questions. And another one he made in relationship to that was that philosophy always buries its undertakers. Right? People that had philosophical experience. He wrote this work on the unity of philosophical experience, and he said people with philosophical experience, if they observe history, they'll recognize that philosophy always buries its undertakers. And I recognize, sure, that's true if you don't understand philosophy correctly. And the only reason for that is because the nature of things buries its undertakers. If your understanding of philosophy is Hegel, it's not going to bury anybody's undertaker. It's going to be the undertaker, or Kant. You try to apply those principles to reality and live them out, you'll go mad very often. So I said, no, Gilson was wrong. He's wrong there. Most philosophical and scientific mistakes start with not knowing what you're talking about. And I didn't realize that until I had been invited to give a paper and organize a conference at the Sorbonne in 2018 for the International Etienne Gilson Society for the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the École Pratique des Hautes Études at the Sorbonne. And so I gave this presentation on Gilson's notion of Christian philosophy, and had to explain why I thought Gilson had misunderstood the nature of Christian philosophy. Misunderstood in the sense that he couldn't make it intelligible. He understood it. He understood it. Just like a person who go into a pizzeria and say, "And this is fantastic pizza. What's the nature of pizza?" And somebody, they'll think they suppose that they'd have to know this precisely, but they don't really. In order to be able to be great at what they were doing, Gilson was great at what he was doing, but he had difficulty articulating what he was doing because he was emphasizing the notion that philosophy is a body of knowledge or a system, logical system of ideas, and you express this body of knowledge of essences, right? And And once they leave your mind and enter the mind of someone else, they take on a life of their own, which is might be radically different from that which existed in your mind. I noticed that with my students, for example, that I would very often say things in class, and once they entered the minds of my students, and they were reported back to me, they became unrecognizable to me. I thought, and like Father Crowley used to say, I'm a failure. It just admitted, well, you can, you can do the best that you can. But anyway, so the biggest problem is not philosophical problem, is not precisely knowing what we're talking about, right? And how we can talk about it to make it understandable, comprehensible to other people. That's one of the reasons why I wrote this book on how to listen and how to speak, which was a reinterpretation of a work by Mortimer Adler on how to speak and how to listen, right? Which Adler wrote really not to understand the nature of rhetoric or communications, but to explain how philosophy is uncommon common sense, and how rhetoric is a kind of a division of philosophy which is essential for communicating common sense. And that rhetoric, in the sense of a philosophical discipline that inculcates the habit of prudence in students, in terms of docilitas, teachability. If someone is not teachable, is unable to listen to what another person is saying, because they can't pay attention to, or not even familiar with the fact that to understand what somebody's saying, and to be able to judge it impartially, like a social scientist should do, an organizational psychologist, you have to do that by abstracting from your emotions and trying to understand the definitions that people are using and the way that they're ordering these definitions to arrive at the conclusions they're doing. If you don't start out that way, if you don't start out talking about the same thing, the same subject, in the same way, right? You're not in the same genus. Right? And I started to realize this actually in preparing this paper for the Sorbonne, reading a work by Father Armand Maurer, the great Basilian Thomistic scholar, where he said for St. Thomas Aquinas, philosophy, first of all, is identical with science, and that it's not a system or body of knowledge. Chiefly, it's not a logical system, it's not a body of knowledge, it's a psychological habit. And I said, oh my God, Father Maurer just has made this genius observation, and he never capitalized on it. He didn't realize what he was saying. He was saying the whole of philosophy is a psychological discipline. It's a psychological activity. Yeah, you can't reunite philosophy and science and wisdom, and get away from media bias and all of these other problems, unless you do this as an impartial social scientist, which Mortimer Adler understood. Adler understood that because he was so obnoxious as a youth at Columbia College, they wouldn't even let him go into the graduate philosophy program. They banned him to psychology. Okay. So anyway, Joseph Pieper, this gets me on to Joseph Pieper, among other people. There were a bunch of people who were trying to solve this repersonalization problem in philosophy, going back to the beginning of the 20th century, all right? And they included Joseph Pieper. I'm going to mention some. I mentioned John Paul II after World War II, and you have Gabriel Marcel, Yves Simon, Jacques Maritain, Georges Bernanos, Gilson, Romano Guardini, Brennan Manning and his ragamuffin gospel, the Southern agrarian movement, people like Flannery O'Connor, Thomas Merton, Stanley Yaki, among others. They all recognize that to some extent a proper solution to the problem lay in recovering the liberal arts, the only problem is recovering the liberal arts the way it's taught today to solve this problem. Very often to people means being able to establish order in schools, periodically meeting to smoke cigars and drink fine wine, memorize Aquinas and understand, some things in Aquinas and understand, and be able to indicate where his principles of natural law are in his Summa Theologia, which to me is not really what's involved in recovering a proper understanding of this our situation and how to solve it. It actually resides in Joseph Pieper's grossly mistranslated book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, because that's not the title of the book in German. The title of the book in German is Musse und Kult, Leisure and Religion. And Pieper is not saying that that leisure is the basis of culture. He's saying, or cult, religion. He's saying religion is the basis of leisure. Right? In fact, he starts this book out, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, with this quote from Plato that but the gods, taking pity on mankind, born to work, laid down the succession of recurring feasts to restore them from their fatigue, and gave them the Muses and Apollo, their leader, and Dionysius as companions in their feasts, so that nourishing themselves in festive companionship with the gods, they should again stand upright and correct. And quoting from Psalms, "Be still and know that I am God." In other words, philosophy, science always begins in religion, because that's where your metaphysical and your moral principles are taken. Yaki understood this in a way when he said science was born of Christianity, meaning science, modern science, in the reductionistic sense of mathematical physics, arose from Catholic universities in Europe. That's totally correct. But strictly speaking, science for the ancient Greeks begins with gods. Begins with inspiration. When Socrates on trial in the Apology talks about his justification for his activity, he talks about the oracle at Delphi and says the oracle at Delphi had sent him on a divine mission. The people in media today have no understanding of the nature of the relationship between religion and culture. They think culture is something simply arbitrary. It was created by science. The people who run the media, they're interested in making money. The people who work for them, they're interested. They think that somehow or other that they are like the oracle at Delphi, that they know what science is, because everybody else that they hang around with, wherever they're going, they all accept what each feels, because they've moved truth out of the human intellect. Descartes did this in book 4 of his Meditation on First Philosophy, where he says that falsity is contained in the will, in a will that causes a wild imagination. Well, if that's true, that's where truth is located also. They're contrary opposites. They're located in the same genus. The will to power starts with Descartes. These people think that they have sincere wills, that they've reduced the emotions to feelings, and they all accept the same feelings. And so one of the worst kinds of bias is not knowing that you're biased. It's that bias in your principles. Descartes claimed that he was following Renaissance humanists and maintaining that the whole of philosophy had been historically transmitted, right? From religion, from the Jews. In getting rid of philosophy and saying that was all backward, what happens historically is the Jews become responsible for all of the bad things that have happened since that time, because they had a false understanding of science. That's it. Amen.